Hello and welcome to On Liberty, coming to you live from the Centre for Independent Studies here in Sydney. I'm Glenn Fay, your host for today's episode, filling in for our regular host, Salvatore Babonis. Joining me on today's episode is Jack McGuire. He's the Managing Director of the Red Union Group, largely representing teachers and nurses. Jack, welcome to the CIS.
Thanks for having me, Glenn.
So to walk us through, what's the Red Union Group? Who are you representing and why?
So the Red Union Group is a service provider that provides services to a number of independent unions. The first of the independent unions sprung up about 10 years ago for nurses in Queensland, off the back of, an unhappiness with the Bligh payroll bungle, which we're still servicing people off the back of that, and that was over a decade ago. And those nurses being uneasy with the Queensland Nurses Union being affiliated with the Labor Party at the time, and so Graham helped those nurses set up an alternative independent union at half the price, and with a prohibition on providing any financial or in-kind support to political parties. Which then went for many years successfully. We then had a group of teachers approach us, and I guess because our service provision to these unions was centralised, it reduces the barrier to entry for setting up a new union. So now we've got a doctors' union, a police union, a drivers' union, an independent workers' union, and the list goes on.
So in what ways is that network different to the traditional offerings available to members?
So we obviously have no ties to political parties, constitutionally prohibited from having ties to political parties. The other unions very often are affiliated to a political party. There is also, the other unions are twice the price, bloated staff. They are registered organisations. They do get a slight legislative advantage over our independent unions, although I say we try harder, so we certainly more than make up for that. But ultimately, it goes back to the Gough Whitlam International Labour Organisation conventions that they brought in, and there's sort of a three-tiered approach to unionism in Australia. The sort of trade union, which is very, very broad and covers everyone as per the ILO provisions, and there's sort of an industrial association, which then carries with it a little bit of regulation and a little bit of standard you meet. Also, punishes executive for taking unlawful industrial action, etc. And then you've got a registered organisation, which again is above and beyond that, which allows you to sort of, transgress property rights, have a right of entry, automatic seat at the bargaining table, so you can sit and negotiate wages without ever having to talk to a member. Whereas if we want to negotiate on wages, we have to be appointed individually en masse by thousands of members, so at least we have to have a conversation with them, which I guess then philosophically then the main difference I suppose is with a registered organisation, one of these traditional unions, they are very, very focused on the collective, and if your view is not in line with the collective, you're silenced. Whereas I guess with our unions, we believe in have a more of a slant towards individualism, but on a mass collective basis, if that makes sense.
Well, I suppose it's an intriguing kind of idea, isn't it? So it's almost suggesting it's more kind of bottom-up collective, sort of a collection of individuals rather than a collective that all individuals need to kind of align to, that's arbitrarily set.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we, for instance, when it comes to bargaining and you have a log of claims and you put that to an employer, we will put everyone's view forward, because even if they are slightly conflicting or different, but we say, how many members feel this way, and ultimately you need 50% plus one of the workforce to get an agreement up. So, all about the individual. We got in trouble with the media over the mandates because we said that, someone pays us money as service dues, etc. We'll, look after them. And for that, we were called anti-vaxxers, even though we were helping those who wanted to get vaccinated earlier, etc. We're playing, again, both sides based on what the individual wanted. But, because we didn't have a collective view that was, one particular thing, and that meant that we were, evil.
So what other sorts of issues? So if you talk about, that if the very large registered organisations have got a series of limitations or are unresponsive to the needs of members, whether it's teachers, nurses? What are the sorts of things that they're failing to represent members on?
Well, I guess ultimately it's more of a concern with public sector unions, and we have found that over the course of our 10 years of operating, there certainly seems to be a reluctance from registered organisations from being too aggressive or loud or highlighting issues when their particular persuasion is in government and sitting in the ministerial seats. So whereas we don't pull a punch regardless of who's in there, but we've often found that at a state level in particular, there's been long periods of Labor governments, and there's plenty of issues just by having, I guess, a long period of any government. There seems to be rot that sets in, and there needs to be sunlight shone on those, because the media do have a role to play in trying to disinfect some of these things. And the only way you get a politician to act is to hit them over the head with votes.
Well, as far as you mentioned the private sector representation, is there a sense that in the current environment that there's too much of an antagonism at times between the role, the position that unions in the private sector take, and particularly small business?
Yeah, good point, Glenn. We have, no great qualms with bosses generally. I know there's a lot of unions that saber rattle against bosses, but ultimately, I think in a private enterprise, employees and employers want a harmonious workplace. Bosses don't want to antagonize and have a battle every day they go to work with their staff. Generally, of course, there are the outliers, but generally they want a harmonious workplace, everyone pulling in the same direction so that the organization's growing. A growing organization means there's more room for wage growth, etc. We have found, again, when we stepped into the place, that there had been lingering issues that would be used to, by registered organizations and these former monopoly unions to sort of, again, there'd be maybe an issue, a minor issue with the boss. They'd point at that, and then they would not really take any steps to fix it, but they would use that as a membership drive and say, oh, look how bad this issue is. I guess we're happy to step in, resolve the issue quickly. If it needs to be litigated because it's that bad, we'll litigate quickly, fix the problem, and again, get everyone back to work and move on with their life.
And it sort of taps into that perhaps some unions are in a kind of a mindset that's from well into the past, that industrial dispute model that was very kind of antagonistic, that I suppose characterized by kind of wharfy disputes, that kind of really antagonistic environment that probably doesn't really reflect many workplaces today.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I don't think there is an us versus them mentality in the workplace in Australia. And as I said, employers want employees to be pulling in the same direction, because ultimately, if businesses grow and become more productive, and usually you need to have happy staff for them to become more productive, then there's more room for the employer to make money, the business to make money, to invest, to expand, to have again more money for wage growth for the employees that are currently there.
Well, perhaps an area where it's maybe less antagonistic, maybe it possibly too comfortable, might be the relationship between some of the very large unions and some very large employers. In what ways does that interrupt the needs of workers?
Oh, we've certainly seen that. Even if you have a look at it was all played out in the Fair Work Commission, the Coles SDA agreement that they had, where penalty rates were essentially flattened in return for a pseudo closed shop. It wasn't mandatory to be in the union, but the union had sort of unprecedented access to employees. And I remember I was working in the deli back in grade 9 or 10, and the weight was certainly put on you at Coles. You had to join the SDA, even though I think I was on $9 an hour and the union membership was $5 or $6. So it's, when you're not getting many hours, it's quite a big portion. But so yeah, absolutely, there is, and we have concerns too that similar arrangement may be on the cards again. where you can have big employers, say like Jennifer Westacott representing big employers, and some of those registered organisations in the private sector getting together around a table, cooking up a deal that then pays workers less, A, and B, gives them a competitive labour advantage over small mum and dad businesses who generally treat their workers better anyway. So, it's sort of worst of all worlds from our point of view.
And is that the impression out of the Jobs and Skills Summit that took place recently, that there's kind of a comfortable relationship reached between the big employers and big unions?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we saw this first play out with the IR omnibus bill that Christian Porter was trying to push and then failed, thankfully. Part of that bill was also going to try and lock us out. Again, that was put forward by the ACTU to try and target the Retail and Fast Food Workers Union in Victoria, because they're lawless and crazy and out of control and need to be stopped. But I guess the real target was probably us, because I think we're some orders of magnitude bigger than them. But those very same principles are now almost exactly what was going to be put in the IR omnibus bill, which again was big business representatives sitting around a table with big unions cooking up deals. Almost everything that was in that proposed in the IR omnibus bill is going to be put forward in legislation post this Jobs and Skills Summit, which again was big businesses sitting around a table with big unions. I even wrote an email saying I'm more than happy to attend. They said it was invite only. I wasn't welcome, which isn't nice. But we represent 17,000 members, and they have industrial interests that would want to be heard as well. But obviously, we don't get the same say as those with a cozy relationship with the government.
Well, sadly, I didn't get an invite either. But probably more significantly, one of the probably biggest emissions from that was the Productivity Commission. And you think about, at the heart of many industrial decisions and determinations is the productivity dividend and that question. So a very puzzling decision, that one. So you've touched upon this issue of anti-competitiveness when it comes to the union sector and the opportunities for members to seek representation. In what ways do we have a almost monopoly system?
So, as I was sort of saying before, there are registered organisations, and the legislative provisions in order to register outline those monopoly provisions. So you have to take 8 or 9 steps, and the 10th step is that if you can already conveniently belong to a registered organisation, then you can't register your own organisation. So spells out the monopoly. It's interesting, we've seen in Queensland though, but sorry, in order to get around that, we had a barrister that we used to brief that was in cabinet for the Labor government when they brought it, with Julia Gillard, when they brought in the Fair Work Act, and having those restrictions, one union only, contravenes the ILO. The ILO, I think Article 2, freedom of association, workers and employers without distinction whatsoever shall have the right to establish and to join organisations of their own choosing without previous authorisation. And then it goes on to say that you really can't regulate what a trade union is. So they had sort of a separate act where you did regulate what a trade union is, but gave them extra. It was sort of an opt-in process. If you'd like these, you get extra treats, but we will regulate you. Whereas, in Australia, then we had industrial associations, trade unions, etc., which could operate separately. But what we've found, because if you just think about the numbers, we've got about 17,000 members times by 440 odd, I think, is how much we charge a year on average. We're turning over something like $6.5 million a year. That's double that for the registered organisations. It's $13 million per annum that they're losing. They're really not happy with us existing and competing against them. And now they've marshalled the state Palaszczuk government to move against us and change the laws to try and make it a lot more difficult to do what we do for nurses and teachers in Queensland.
So that's a sort of puzzling development, isn't it? That a Queensland Labor government appears to be acting to restrict the activities and association of workers into a trade union. How do we get to that point?
they acknowledge that it restricts their rights, their human rights. They brought in a Human Rights Act in 2019, which Queenslanders now have a human right to form and join trade unions. But this ultimately impinges on that human right. They acknowledge that, but they don't care. They just do not want us to exist. So they changed the registration rules to make it even harder to register. They looked at our structure and said, well, your structure, we can't have that. So you're now barred from registering. And then further, there's going to be, the ability for ancillary orders to, prevent us from representing people in the QRC, arranging an agent for people to represent people in the QRC, removing historic protections for industrial associations, that sort of tier 2 union I was talking about, which has been around since the GOF days. So seriously, it's a government without precedent in terms of trashing workers' rights and workplace rights. And I guess, the only way that I can reconcile it is if you follow the money. And, you've got certain people in government, even I think Grace was employed by the Queensland Nurses Union during her years out of government. You've got, a member of Parliament who is still a member of the Queensland Nurses Union. So there's sort of a lot of obviously Labor members who are members of these registered organisations. So just seems a little bit like there's a lot like there's a massive conflict of interest, I would say, in having these union members in Parliament trying to outlaw as best they can independent unions to try and force those members back into, I guess, Labor-aligned unions who then prop up election campaigns and help them, rinse and repeat.
Staying on Queensland government, and particularly education department activity recently, one of the recent developments was that some teachers were looking to suffer a pay cut compared to their peers in an industry where, whenever we try to talk about differential pay, particularly as a motivator for recognition of highly effective outcomes, we're told it's beyond the pale to consider differential pay arrangements. And yet there seems to be a differential pay arrangement on the basis of health status. How did we land in that situation?
Yeah, and the union movement forever have been talking about same pay for same job. It's an interesting precedent for a Labor minister to set. I'd be interested to know whether she would also agree with a private sector employer docking pay of staff for not following orders. But yeah, no, that was an outrageous example of why you need a second union. The other union was very silent on that issue, where teachers had been penalised a second time, sometimes a third time. We had teachers out who were in state-owned housing, renting, were kicked out of their rentals for not complying with mandates, and then were forced to pay rent while they weren't allowed in their house. So just craziness.
So I think one of the differentiating markers of particularly the Teachers Professional Association in Queensland, where there's a clear distinction with the Queensland Teachers Union, has been on the handling of NAPLAN. The Queensland Teachers Union has had a long-running campaign against the test and trying to scrap the test for a range of reasons, and even put a ban, or attempted to put a ban on members preparing students for the assessment, even though it's an important marker of core literacy and numeracy, which seems something that, of course, everyone thinks is an important work of educators. Mm-hmm. How did you arrive at a different conclusion to where the QTU landed?
Well, I guess it's interesting. Our members, I would say, skew towards being high quality teachers. And I don't think I'm biased in saying that. And I think one of the main reasons the Queensland Teachers Union don't like NAPLAN is because they believe that it could be used to highlight underperforming teachers. Ultimately, it isn't. But I guess, we don't see any problem with having, better pay for higher performing teachers, because, again, I would say that most of our members are in that category of higher performing teachers. Again, highlights the reason why there needs to be a second voice in the market. You can't have a contest of ideas or a battle of ideas with one union, particularly when one union has this fierce collective mentality where, if you are part of the 49%, not the 51%, you're totally silent. So having us even play in that space and talk about this NAPLAN, ultimately our teachers thought there was a good idea. NAPLAN's not without its faults, but it is a good idea to have standardized testing to try and highlight where weaknesses are in funding to be able to prop up, suburbs or schools that are struggling, who may need more resources. And I guess just as an ongoing test to see whether the school is on the improve or on the decline. And, there's a lot of data that can be taken from it.
Well, not least of which that many teachers are also parents, and it's an important information tool for parents to understand and make remediation for their own children's needs.
And good point, because I was going to say that's part of our manifesto is part of the TPAQ's manifesto, where we differ significantly, and we say that the main client of the teacher is the student and the parent. Yeah. I think that if you were to ask the same question of the Queensland Teachers Union, or the way that they have allowed it to develop, the main client of the teacher is now the department, and it's doing what the department says, department's bidding, and they are, in fact, the people that you must appease. Whereas I believe, and the TPAQ believes, it should be the getting a better outcome for that kid, and that kid also, has input from parents.
It also seems that over the last 10, 15 years, there's been an increasing problem or challenge facing new teachers and new nurses about being underprepared for the work that they find themselves. So even though they might have been asked to do additional study than they have in the past and so on, they seem less prepared. And that you see that in all kinds of surveys and different kind of placement approaches that are taken. They don't seem to be actually serving the need of that new teacher and new nurse. But I haven't heard unions necessarily be that constructive in proposing solutions to that challenge.
No, it's interesting that you touch on that, because one of the main flagship cases that we still have before the Commission, 2 years later, it's still going, was over one of our nurses, who's now President Mark Gilbert, speaking out about the underpreparedness and the failure of universities to adequately train nurses for the workplace. Never done, skills like inserting a catheter or cannulation, or, things that are basic requirements of sort of the job of nursing. And for that, they were targeted. For that, she was targeted by Queensland Health, and tried to be punished, and we've had to defend her. So a lot of those people that were trying to punish Marg, we found out, were from the union. So just higher up in management. So it's bizarre. I mean, we are absolutely focused on trying to improve, the profession, making people job ready. We have outreach programs into school, to universities, getting people on board earlier, and doing sort of mentor programs where we have people from the profession trying to help those in universities. So there is quite a lot of value for a university student to get involved and hear from real life working professionals about what's required. But absolutely, I have no idea why they wouldn't, why the registered organisations wouldn't do the same. Perhaps there's never really been an impetus for them to be proactive and to come up with these sort of things, because if you're the only kid on the block or the only supermarket on the block, everyone's got to shop from you. So
quite right. We're almost out of time, but I wanted to ask you a final question. During a recent Google search, it became apparent to me that you drew the ire of another opponent, and that's the Communist Party of Australia, who seemed to take offence that you had labelled yourself the Red Union, and it applied a warning notice to its members not to be fooled into joining a fake union. Are you a fake union? And does the Communist Party of Australia own the colour red?
No, we're certainly not a fake union. Goodness, we've got 17,000 members and collect resources to fight battles against, some of the biggest employers in the country, being the states. So no, I don't know. I don't see how that's a fake union at all, particularly when we spend so much money on defending members' interests. But yeah, colour red, gosh. Sometimes I wish we didn't choose the colour red, because we often get people confusing us for the Communist Party. And we certainly don't hold ourselves out to be the Communist Party, and would be seriously worried if people thought that we were communists, because it couldn't be further from the truth. Ultimately, the story is a lot more banal. It's just, the MPAQ, when it started out, chose a colour red for its logo, and then the TPAQ followed suit, and all of a sudden, I guess, now Colgate, Coca-Cola, and the Red Unions are all communists.
The conspiracy is bigger than they thought, in fact. Jack, thanks for being part of On Liberty. Pleasure having you.
No, thanks, Glenn. Appreciate it.
And that was episode 99 of On Liberty. Join us again in a fortnight's time for episode 100, where my colleague Tom Switzer interviews our regular host, Salvatore Babonis. Hope to see you again then.